Hi people, Chris here for 203 and we are on to week 8 and it's Angry Birds, isn't it? Yeah, alright, it's not Angry Birds, it's the Gulls, I suppose. I better stop playing games. I'm joking. Hang on, I might finish this one. Right, on to the proper stuff. Yes, enough of me playing games or being silly. Justin, first up. So your angry gull, your angry bird. Yeah, definitely expressing itself, which is good. I love the fact that you've actually got the leg in partial movement, and there's that sense of motion there. Just a bit of a shame your crop is quite unbalanced from one point of things. There's just as much, no, there's more negative space behind the bird than there is in front. So really, I would try and pull this in a lot more, just so that you're actually giving the gull somewhere to go, and some space in behind. You mentioned in your description that you deliberately used a shallow f-stop so that you ended up creating that depth of field, so your eye goes straight to the bird, which is good, but you do need to think about the other elements of composition as well. And yeah, it's nice and sharp. There is some motion in the step of the bird, but that works, and it's definitely showing the attitude. Minor tweak that I would do. Zoom in a little bit more, and that's just to pick up some of the detail in that eye, which is just using that clarity function. You don't want to overdo it, but just giving that little bit of a pop to the eye. Hopefully you can see the difference between the two. It just gives it that little bit of an edge, given that you're dealing with fairly flat light to start with. Right, Sean, let's have a look at yours, and you had permission to do something other than your seagulls because you're having problems with that and so yeah, we've got a cranky Tui instead. He's not as cranky as he could be, but that glare's quite an interesting one. You mentioned in your discussion about the fact that you needed to kick up the ISO a little bit more so you got your exposure increased, and you're quite right about that. The other thing with a black and white is that background could be pushed quite a lot higher, and I would still crop in further than you have. So probably playing with something more like this, to still use the branches as part of your frame, and still keep the tui on the third, although we're swapped on the other side. Lift up some of the detail, trying to get some of the detail out of the feathers and stuff, although to be honest that's pushing it too far. But also to have an almost white background rather than a grey one. That way we're playing with the contrast, and it's a much more punchy image than it was to start with. It looks like you've done a bit of editing around the head, and unfortunately you've slipped off, so you've got a patch of white there. Be careful with that. If you can't see it on your computer, then make sure that your calibration on your monitor's good. If you can't see the difference between the 0 and 5%, then that's probably a case of you not being able to tell that that's actually that change has actually happened. And the reason for cropping in is I first of all looked at it and went, oh, I'll just clone that out. But as soon as you do that, you can see that there's negative space here, but it's not adding anything to the image. You've then got this piece here. Well, if we get rid of that, yeah, it's alright, but really the focus is the tui, so crop in on it if the image can stand it. Obviously, I'm working on your version of the shot, so resolution wise it's falling to pieces. Whether or not you can actually get away with it, yeah, you can only tell if you've got that amount of resolution in from your raw file. Right, Jennifer, so you've given me a good description about your technical side of things in terms of making sure that you're using f8 to give that sharp aperture and give depth of field, and your shutter speed, etc. What you haven't told me about is why you chose the composition you've got, and what it was really about the story that you were trying to get out of this particular shot with the birds. So yeah, remember to make sure that you include that side of things into your discussion as well. For me, the story really ties around this one gull, and particularly having this group here as onlookers don't really give you anything extra, and in fact start drawing your attention away. So I would crop this in to something like this, which gets rid of some of that negative space that we've got at the top, and that whiter area which tends to fight and draw your eye up. But it also means that you've got a stronger eye line looking back here. You've got this gull which is looking a little bit defensive, and so adds more strength to the fact that this one's somewhat grumpy. So yeah, whereas these ones looking on, it reduces the impact of this particular bird, and doesn't really add anything to the story, and kind of drags your eye off this side a little bit too much. Whereas those three in a row, actually it's four, isn't it, because there's one hiding behind there, just tightens that story up. Lets you see a bit more detail out of the rocks as well, which is good. Exposure wise, you've nailed it. Love the colours. Lighting works really well. But yeah, just need to refine the story, and think about how the story's been told. What story is it that you're trying to do, and then is the crop working for what you're playing with? And that's one of the reasons that we want that discussion in there, because hopefully when you're actually writing about it, you're thinking about that part of the process of composition, and so you may well, as you're writing it, go, oh, hang on, I can crop that better because what I'm trying to do is pull that story into these ones. So yeah, just make sure that you do include that in your discussion. Right, so let's have a look at yours. Well, for starters, thank you for the second upload, because I was going through and going, oh no, you've missed your description, but you had included it in the second one, so that's good. In terms of the composition, you're mentioning about the utilising the diagonals for the position of the birds. I'm sort of missing what you're talking about on that one. Compositionally, there's an interesting setup between the orange of these two. That orange against a slightly blue background of the shadows makes quite an interesting compositional tool. And you have popped this one on the thirds, this one's almost on the thirds too, so that works. The problem though is that the main gull, the grumpy one, and he's in a prominent position because of his attitude and colouring, is out of focus, which is really not a good option. This one here has been overexposed. You have recovered some of those highlights, but it's still you've lost the detail in those highlights that would have been there to start with. Although if I pull this back, right back, there is some detail there, so you possibly could actually get in there with a selective adjustment brush and recover some of those highlights anyway. Now it's still losing it on that the breast about. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit more about here. You've got some detail there, and then this patch here is just plain white. So need to be careful when you're actually doing your exposure that you're not clipping your highlights as much as you have done. That bird on the edge, I think, is a really interesting idea from a compositional point of view. It's a bit of a shame about the shadow of this one that's just off the screen, and I think the play between those two just as a pair would have been interesting, but again we've got that problem of depth of field and this one being out of focus. You could have increased your f-stop, and you could have increased your ISO a little bit. Remember, you did right at the week one, you should have had a look at how high you can lift your ISO before it becomes an issue. Most cameras would cope with that f4, but also you've got some of the exposure that you can, because you're overexposing your whites, you need to to pull that back a little bit anyway. So you've probably got a couple of, maybe one stop to pull back just to sort out those highlights. So you do have some room to play and get that depth of field. But yeah, real shame that that bird is actually out of focus. Right, Anamika, let's have a look at your gull. And interestingly, this one's missing a leg. And I think that adds to the story that you're telling with it. Unfortunately, it's not as grumpy or as it's not displaying an attitude as much as it could do. I do like the eye contact that it's got and the fact that it's staring down the camera. I also like the fact that you've composed this with a square crop, and that would have been really good to tell me why you chose a square crop in this one. Interestingly, the balance on it means that although the gull is kind of to one side, it's still looking straight down the camera at you, so it's not feeling like it's too close to the edge, and because you've got that line of both the leg and the beak being red focal points standing out against that grey background, that works from a compositional point of view as well, because it's giving you that colour as the point to focus on. But again, you need to include that in your justification. You've done a good job of justifying your f-stop and shutter speed and all the other bits and pieces as well, and the fact that you're utilising that depth of field to give you some depth of field, but also let the background go out of focus. But yeah, you need to include why you've actually chosen the composition you have. So yeah, you're getting there. It's getting good. Right, Tanya, well, yep, you've already identified that it's not as grumpy as it needed to be, but you have managed to catch an interesting action shot, and the lighting on it is really nice. Square crop works reasonably well, as you said. That little patch of sky at the top would have been nice if you could have removed it, but such is life in this assignment. You don't have the option to play with Photoshop. But yeah, I mean, had you got that bird with it being with its neck outstretched and squawking, then I think it would have really finished the picture off. Unfortunately, the birds didn't behave themselves, but yeah, I do, however, like the fact that you've justified that really well in terms of what worked and what didn't. Unfortunately, if the birds aren't going to behave, the birds aren't going to behave. Right, Daryl, let's have a look at yours. And from an exposure point of view, it's all behaving itself quite nicely. There is a distinct wariness to the gull, but that wasn't what you were asked for. You were asked for grumpiness. So it is missing the brief from that point of view. Composition's almost there. The driftwood that's washed up on the beach is a bit of a distraction, which is unfortunate. I really like the pebbles that you've got in the foreground, and had they been able to continue the whole way through the shot, I think it would have been a lot stronger, because it would have allowed the bird to stand out more against that plain background. Probably would have cropped off the beach, the sea as well, although it does make a nice colour combination between the red and the greeny blue. But yeah, that the washed up sticks and stuff is not great, especially as you've got one coming out of its head. Potentially you could have gone with a shallow depth of field to make that more blurred, but I'm not even sure that's going to ultimately solve the challenge with it. Let's see. That's the clarity function. That's not really working, is it? Contrast. I'm not looking at the bird, I'm just looking at the background. It might have worked if that had been blurred out more, but I don't think so. It's just about changing the angle to make sure that you get that clean background. But yeah, other than that, it's a competently taken shot, and yeah, just it's missing the grumpiness side of things that was part of the brief. Right, Dan, I love the story that you've told about about the man feeding the birds and this guy just sitting there and screaming for about 5 minutes. Um, but you've not told me anything about why you chose the shutter speed and aperture that you did, and why you chose the composition or the image. Um, and you've got some really interesting stuff going on here with the yellow beak versus the blue sky. You've utilized depth of field really well, but you haven't told me about it, so that's not very helpful. There is a bit of a tweak that I would do in your post-production, and that is to try and lighten this side of the face up a little bit more. Oops, not the background. I'm going to have to mask that a lot better. But the reason for lifting that up is that we really want to be drawn to the front of the face, not the back of the head. So it needs that fine-tuning. From a post-production point of view, it would have been nice if we'd got the bird just tipped a little bit more towards the camera rather than straight off. But you have got the horizon line level, which is good. It looks, in fact, it looks like it's slightly not, because it's slightly lighter here than it is here, so there's a bit of weight distribution in the image that tricks your eye into thinking it's not straight, but it is, so that's fine. But yeah, just be careful that you actually include all of that detail about why you've chosen the settings you did, and that little bit of fine-tuning and tweaking. And maybe if within that 5-minute series you've got one where the head's twisted a little bit more around to the camera, would help with the viewer engagement. Right, Adrian, let's have a look at yours, and I wish you'd got closer. The grass here being out of focus in the foreground and quite a bright, vibrant colour is really dragging my eye away from the birds. You mentioned that you struggled to get something that was grumpy, and yeah, he's displaying a little bit, but not very much. And it's a shame that this one at the back hasn't really got involved either. You mentioned in your brief or in your description that you wanted to use a really shallow depth of field, but you had to stop down to f8. I don't understand why. There's no reason that you shouldn't have been able to just increase your shutter speed. Potentially, if you've got ISO 200, yeah, you're on a Canon, so you can decrease that to 100. So yeah, I'm not sure why you couldn't stop down more than that to blur out your background. Would it have saved the image? Probably not. It really is one that you needed to keep going and keep taking more photos until you got that shot. And yeah, sometimes the birds don't play ball and it takes hours to do, and sometimes you walk up and get it in one go. It's unfortunately the challenge with nature of photography, really.